So I have seen the Garfield movie, and I'm gonna be honest, I do not understand all the bad reviews that this movie is getting because I enjoyed my time with this thing. I thought they did a pretty good job with this movie, so let's talk about it. Now, given that this movie is not technically out yet, I'm gonna keep this video spoiler free, but if you do wanna see what I gave this movie out of 10, head over to my shorts, TikTok, or Instagram and check out my one-take movie review on this movie. But without further ado, let's talk about the Garfield movie. So this movie is directed by Mark Dindal, and he is the guy who also did Emperor's New Groove and Chicken Little, and those are two movies that I thoroughly enjoyed when I was a kid. So in this movie, we of course follow Garfield, and he is essentially living the perfect life for a cat. He's eating lasagna, he's hating Mondays, and he's hanging out with John and Odie. But once he has a reunion with his long-lost dad, the two find themselves, along with Odie, on a big heist mission for an evil cat. As always, starting things off with the good, and the first thing I have here is both Chris Pratt and Sam L. Jackson. Now, I know Chris Pratt has gotten some hate for his voice acting roles over the years, but in my opinion, I've never really had a problem with any of his voice acting performances. I thought he's always done a pretty solid job at the roles that he has been given. And when it came to his role as Garfield, I think he did a pretty solid job at that too. Now, I will say that he did sound a lot like Chris Pratt in this movie, but for me, that didn't really bother me as I was watching this thing. I thought he nailed the sarcastic humor in this thing, and he also had a bunch of one-liners that just made me laugh out loud. I mean, there was even a Daniel Day-Lewis joke in there, and there was a lot of references to Tom Cruise. I mean, the third act of this movie was essentially Mission Impossible with Garfield inserted in there, and there was also a huge nod to Top Gun as well in that third act. But anyways, in my opinion, Chris Pratt carried a lot of this movie, and when you pair that up with Sam L. Jackson, who is always great and played his dad in this movie, you get some pretty fun banter back and forth throughout the entire film. But with all that said, Odie is the one who truly stole the show in my opinion. He didn't say a single word throughout this entire movie, but he was always doing something funny in the background or just making these super funny facial expressions throughout the movie when he was dealing with Garfield and his dad. Next up for the good, I have the humor. Now, obviously a lot of the humor in this movie was geared towards kids and families, and I thought a lot of that humor did work, but there was also some humor in there for adults to enjoy as well. A lot of the humor obviously came from Garfield, and it was very sarcastic, but as I said before, it was really the subtle one-liners that would get me in this thing. And on top of Garfield and Odie probably being the funniest characters in this movie, Ving Rhames, who played Otto in this film, was also really funny as well. There was a running joke on Otto's mannerisms throughout this thing that I really enjoyed, and also it was just hilarious that Ving Rhames was even in this movie, considering that this thing took a lot from the Mission Impossible movies, which he was also in. And the more I think about it, the more I realize he was essentially just playing the same character in this movie that he would play in the Mission Impossible movies, because in those movies he would help Ethan plan and execute the missions that he would go on, and in this Garfield movie he was helping Garfield plan and execute the mission slash heist that he had to go on. So yes, I enjoyed the humor in this movie. It was sarcastic, it was witty, it was just pretty much all around goofy, and I had a lot of fun with it. Next up for the good, I have the story, and as funny and as goofy as this movie was, this is one of those things that surprised me when I watched this movie. Behind all the humor and all the fun was really a story about a father and a son reconnecting and having a relationship again. And this movie did a really good job at giving us a backstory on the relationship of Garfield and his dad from really both sides of the story, so we could understand where each character was coming from. So when we got to some of the more serious and emotional parts of this movie, they actually worked out really well. Now, yes, this story was a bit predictable at times, but for a kids movie that was just trying to be silly and goofy and entertain kids for an hour and a half or so, this story did really well for me. And finally, for the good, I have the animation. Now, I really enjoyed the animation in this thing. It really felt like I was watching Looney Tunes on Saturday mornings at certain points in this movie with some of the things they pulled off in this thing. I mean, if you've seen the movie, you kind of know what I'm talking about, whether it was Garfield launching himself onto a train and getting hit by a bunch of different things, or just the way their bodies would contort when certain things would happen, just really reminded me of the Looney Tunes. And even though this was 3D animated, there was a lot of Looney Tune-ish things going on in this movie, and I really enjoyed that because that kind of spoke to the more nostalgic side of me, because I was definitely more of a Looney Tunes guy than I was a Garfield guy back in the day. Moving on to the so-so, and the first thing I have here is the fourth wall breaking. Now, don't get me wrong, I did enjoy when Garfield broke the fourth wall in this movie, but the reason I have this here is because they were pretty inconsistent with doing it throughout the movie. I felt like it was one of those elements that they kind of forgot that they were doing it throughout the movie. I mean, we start this thing with Garfield breaking the fourth wall quite a bit, and then he doesn't really do it ever again until the end of the movie. So when they finally did get back around to doing it at the end of the movie, it just felt really random to me, because I was just sitting there like, oh yeah, I kind of forgot that we were doing this whole fourth wall breaking thing, and it just kind of made it feel like they were sitting there and said, hey, I don't think we've broken the fourth wall in a while, we should probably do that. I did enjoy it, but it was one of those things that I feel like they either should have cut completely or just been a little bit more consistent with it throughout the movie, so I don't forget as a viewer that we are breaking the fourth wall in this movie. Next up for the so-so I have is that this movie is pretty predictable and it doesn't really reinvent the wheel in any way. Long story short, this movie plays it pretty safe all around. Yes, I did enjoy the story and humor in this thing, even though it was kind of something that you've seen before, but then again, that was not this movie's goal. It set out to entertain families and kids and make them laugh and have a good time, and I think it did that. However, I could see some people growing bored of this movie, given that it is pretty predictable and a lot of the humor you've probably heard in a different way in another movie before, and also the story doesn't really do anything to really shock you in this thing. And finally, getting into the bad, and the first thing I have here is that the ending of this was a little drawn out for me. Now, I get that they were just trying to wrap things up right there at the end of the movie, but after we had that big third final act, I thought this thing was gonna end pretty quickly, but then I was like, oh, there's still a solid like 10 minutes left in this thing. Now, it wasn't anything terrible, but it did feel like we were in the epilogue of the film right there at the end, and I think they could have gotten through those scenes a little bit quicker than they did. And finally, for the bad, and this is something that didn't necessarily bother me, but I could see it bothering the true fans of Garfield, and that is that this movie really doesn't stay true to the character of Garfield. It doesn't necessarily feel like the Garfield that you knew when you were a kid. Now, the things that make Garfield Garfield, like him loving lasagna, hating Mondays, bossing around Odie, and hanging out with John, they really kind of rushed over in the first 10 to 15 minutes of this film. But after that, we jump into this big heist plot that takes up pretty much the rest of the movie, and we don't get back to real Garfield things until the end of this thing. And for those who grew up with Garfield and are huge fans of Garfield, I could see them not really liking that, because this is not the same Garfield that they knew when they were kids. But for someone like me who knew of Garfield as a kid but really wasn't a big fan of Garfield, I was more into Power Rangers, superheroes, and Disney Channel, so I didn't really have this preconceived notion of who exactly Garfield should be as a character, because he just wasn't a big part of my childhood. So for me, it didn't really bother me when I was watching this movie and Garfield didn't feel like Garfield, because essentially I didn't really grow up with Garfield. But for those who did grow up with Garfield and love Garfield, I could understand why they might not like this movie. So all in all, for me, the Garfield movie is a fun family film that I think lots of people will get enjoyment out of. Chris Pratt is good as Garfield, the humor is solid, and it has a surprisingly good story, even though it is kind of predictable for a movie that just wants to be silly and entertain. So if you're looking for a fun family movie, I think this one deserves a watch. Those are my thoughts on the Garfield movie. Be sure to let me know what you thought of the movie down in the comments, and as always, be sure to like, subscribe, comment, get your Eazy Apparel at shopeasyapparel.com. God bless, and I'll see you guys later. Peace.